Hi, I'm Mr. Loomis, and this is the final review of Unit 9 about business, workers, and government during the Gilded Age. Hopefully, as you studied this moment in history, you realize that although this was over 100 years ago, many of the things that happened back then are still important today. Things like philanthropy, union organizing, and keeping our elected leaders from being influenced by wealthy donors are still things we can see in the news all the time today. Before we dive into our review, let's get ourselves oriented in the bigger picture of American history. Unlike many other times in history, there weren't very many turning point events during the Gilded Age. So to put things in perspective, we can divide this broad time in history into some big chunks. Overall, the Gilded Age comes after the Civil War, which was in the 1860s. Before 1900, we have a lot more stories about corruption in government, like the story of Boss Tweed, for example. Before 1900, there's also more of what we call laissez-faire. This means that the government was more on the side of business. Things didn't change all at once, of course, but after 1900, we definitely hear more stories about the government trying to help out everyday Americans. For example, Teddy Roosevelt became president in 1901, and most of the stories about trust busting and reform are from his time as president or afterward. This long time in history comes to an end with the arrival of World War I, just before 1920. So the Gilded Age ran roughly from the end of the Civil War in the 1860s up through World War I. Another way to think about it is to remember that it was the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s. Sometimes historians will call this time the turn of the century. We broke down our study of this unit into 4 lessons. Let's get started. Our first lesson was about the very wealthiest Americans. You don't need to memorize every single detail about these men, but it's good to remember a few of them and the businesses that they made their money in. But also notice that there were some very different opinions about them. The time we're studying was called the Gilded Age. So to quote an old movie, show me the money.
Big idea. In the late 1800s, the Industrial Revolution went into overdrive. Business in America was dominated by a few enormously wealthy tycoons who engaged in unethical business practices, but also gave away their fortunes to benefit all of society. In the decades after the Civil War, the Industrial Revolution exploded in the North. This period saw a rise in consolidation and the development of monopolies dominated by extraordinarily wealthy industrialists. Cornelius Vanderbilt dominated the transportation industry. He started with ferries, but later owned the New York Central Railroad. It was the first to start giving away his fortune. His money built Vanderbilt University. Andrew Carnegie consolidated the steel industry. Pittsburgh grew as the center of the steel industry. Carnegie sold his steel empire to J.P. Morgan in 1901. He gave his money away to build libraries, universities, and Carnegie Hall in New York City. Andrew Mellon was a leader in the banking industry. He also served in government as Secretary of the Treasury. He gave his money to build the National Art Gallery in Washington, D.C. J.P. Morgan was also a banker. He bought Carnegie's Steel Company and renamed it U.S. Steel. He also owned controlling stakes in General Electric, AT&T, and numerous railroads. John D. Rockefeller was the nation's richest man. He owned Standard Oil. He pioneered the use of trusts as a way to avoid antitrust laws. Rockefeller gave his money away to build universities and hospitals. Other great industrialists of the time included Marshall Field, who owned a department store chain, and Leland Stanford, who owned land and railroads in California. Stanford University was built with his money. William Clark dominated copper mining. People who admired these men called them captains of industry. Those who criticized them for their underhanded competitive tactics and mistreatment of workers called them robber barons. Some of these industrialists tried to dominate all of one stage of a business. For example, Clark bought all the copper mines. This is a horizontal monopoly. Others bought one company at each stage of a business. Carnegie bought a steel mine, an iron ore mine, railroads, and ships. This is a vertical monopoly. Rockefeller used trusts to hide his business. In this way, he controlled many companies that the public thought were competitors.
Our second lesson focused on money and the way money was used for both good and bad during the Gilded Age. Notice that these stories were both old and new at the same time. While the people in these stories are long gone, the things they did are still things people do today.
Big idea. The late 1800s was a time of both enormous political corruption and the beginning of corporate philanthropy. The years after the Civil War saw a series of forgettable presidents who did not have much power relative to Congress. One thing government dealt with was corruption. The Pendleton Civil Service Act made many government jobs open to candidates based on competitive exams. This helped limit the spoils system of giving jobs as rewards for supporting political candidates. This period was also a time of corruption in city governments. Big city mayors used their power to give jobs and contracts to friends. In exchange, they bought votes, stayed in power, took bribes, and became rich. These political machines were common. The most famous was nicknamed Tammany Hall in New York. Money was not always a source of corruption and evil. Andrew Carnegie's essay, The Gospel of Wealth, encouraged the wealthy to use their money to benefit humanity.
In our third lesson, we shifted gears to talk about the workers. Notice especially how things shifted over time. While workers struggled in the beginning, in the second half of the Gilded Age, their unions started to have more success. Again, these are stories that are still repeating themselves today.
Big idea. Organized labor unions emerged in the late 1800s, although their efforts were often limited because government generally sided with business owners. The period after the Civil War saw a growth of labor unions. Labor unions used boycotts and strikes to stop work and try to force owners to meet their demands. Owners locked out workers and hired scabs to break strikes. Most strikes in the late 1800s went badly for workers. A large number of immigrants were willing to work for low wages and take the place of striking workers. Government usually supported owners, and the police and army broke strikes at Carnegie's steel plant in Pittsburgh and a strike at the Pullman Railroad Car Factory in Chicago. The Great Upheaval of 1877 was the nation's first mass strike, as workers in the railroad industry started a strike that spread and was supported by striking workers across the nation. The first major union was the Knights of Labor. They lost support after the Haymarket Square riot. A new union grew as the Knights of Labor fell out of favor. The American Federation of Labor was led by Samuel Gompers and focused on basic issues like wages and working conditions instead of political reform. The AFL was a composite of many smaller craft unions, so they did not represent unskilled workers. Eugene Debs led the American Socialist Party. This group wanted to change America's system of government. They wanted to take leadership of the nation's industries away from the rich. Although they were popular with workers, they never gained the support of more than a small percentage of Americans. A more extreme group were the industrial workers of the world. They wanted a violent revolution to take power away from the wealthy and to overthrow the government. Although Americans rejected these ideas, they eventually caught on in Russia and led to the communist revolution there in 1917.
Our last unit was all about the way the government can assert its power to stop business leaders from getting carried away. One interesting lesson to take away from this is that great leaders are still human and susceptible to all the same faults we have, like ego, ambition, and hubris.
Big idea. A series of progressive presidents in the first decades of the 1900s, beginning with Teddy Roosevelt, tried to balance the power of workers and owners and took trusts and monopolies to court. Theodore Roosevelt took an interesting road to the White House. He was born rich, became a national hero in the Spanish-American War, was briefly a cowboy, became governor of New York, and eventually vice president. Republican leaders who didn't like Roosevelt chose him to be vice president on purpose because they believed he would be sidelined and would have no influence. They didn't expect McKinley to be assassinated. As president, Theodore Roosevelt wanted to balance the needs of workers and owners. When trusts were beneficial to the growth of the nation, he ignored them. When he thought business leaders were hurting people and the nation, he took them to court to break up their monopolies. Roosevelt grew tired of the job and helped William Howard Taft win as his successor. Taft continued Roosevelt's trust-busting ways. In 1912, Roosevelt came back, this time with his own Bull Moose Party, to try to win back his old job. Republicans were split between Taft and Roosevelt, giving the electoral win to Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat. Wilson was also a progressive and used government's power to promote reform. During his time in office, he created the Federal Reserve to stabilize the nation's banking system and the Federal Trade Commission to oversee business practices.
Thank you for watching all the way through to the end. Use the Quizlet set to help you remember all the people and key ideas in this unit. Of course, make sure that you also review the study guide with the summaries. Please study hard. This was the Gilded Age, and I want your test grade to be gilded too.